The rain has been falling for 2 days straight. Not the hard, dramatic kind, but the thin, patient kind that gets into everything. Into your boots, into your sleeping bag, into the place behind your eyes where your confidence used to live. There are 7 of them moving down the mountain in a single line. And the woman at the front knows this range better than most people know their own neighborhoods. She's been leading groups through places like this for decades. She knows what cold looks like when it turns serious. She knows the difference between discomfort and danger. She has brought people home from conditions worse than this. The last person in the line is a 23-year-old named Sasha. He is young and fit and experienced, and he has been talking for most of the morning. And then he isn't. He goes down without a sound. And when the woman at the front turns around to see why the line is stopped, she sees blood. This is still unexplained. Brief explorations of unsolved mysteries. My name is Mark. The Khamar Daban range runs along the southern edge of Siberia, just south of Lake Baikal. If you know anything about Lake Baikal, you know it's one of those places that earns its reputation. It holds more fresh water than all 5 of the Great Lakes combined. It's the deepest lake on the earth. The water is so clear, you can see down more than 130 feet, 40 meters on a good day. The whole region has this quality about it: ancient and enormous and indifferent to whatever is happening on its surface. The Khamar Daban range sits just to the south of that lake, forming a kind of natural wall between the lake basin and the Mongolian steppe beyond it. The peaks top out at around 7,500 feet, 2,300 meters, which is not the Himalayas, not even close. But the weather doesn't know that. Cold air masses roll in from the east. Moisture comes off the lake. When those two things meet over the Khamar Daban, you can get brutal conditions at altitudes that shouldn't produce them. The range has a reputation among Russian hikers, and not entirely a good one. But people go. People love it, in fact. The valleys are dense with taiga forest, larch and cedar and pine, and in the summer the upper slopes bloom with wildflowers, including a plant called aconite, which is beautiful and extraordinarily toxic. The trails are well established. The region around Buryatia has a long hiking tradition, and in the summer of 1993, a group of 7 people set out on a route that they had every reason to believe they could handle. This was 2 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia was in a state of upheaval that is hard to overstate, but in the mountains, the upheaval was far away, and a group of hikers from a club called Azumut was doing what hikers do, moving through the wilderness, making camp, carrying weight, and covering ground. The group leader was Ludmila Korovina. She was 41 years old and held the title of Master of Sports in Hiking, which in a Soviet and post-Soviet tradition is an actual formal designation and means something. You don't get it by being pretty good. You get it by being exceptional over a long period of time under rigorous conditions. Korovina had spent most of her adult life in the Russian wilderness. She knew what she was doing, and everyone who knew her agreed on that. With her were 6 others, most of them significantly younger. There was Alexander Krishin, 23, who went by Sasha and was considered Korovina's most promising student. Tatiana Filippenko, 24, Denis Skachkin, 19, and 3 teenagers, 17-year-old Valerita Unchenko, 16-year-old Victoria Zalasova, and 15-year-old Timur Banapov. The youngest was 15. And I want you to hold that. They started their route in early August 1993. The first few days went well. The group made good time, reached the summit of a peak called Le Translator ahead of schedule, and everything was moving the way it was supposed to move. And then on August 4th, the weather came in. Heavy rain, cold temperatures, the kind of conditions that aren't catastrophic, but are thoroughly miserable. The group camped in an exposed position on the slope that night. which struck some later observers as a strange call, because there was a tree line about 3 miles, 5 kilometers down that would have offered real shelter. Korovina, for whatever reason, chose to stay where they were. Maybe she thought the weather would break. Maybe the group was too tired to push down the slope in the rain. We don't know. But on the morning of August 5th, they broke camp and began their descent. What happened next has been described by investigators, researchers, and writers for more than 30 years, and it still doesn't quite make sense no matter how many times you read it. Sasha Krishin, the 23-year-old at the back of the line, collapsed. Not slowly, suddenly. He fell to the ground, bleeding from his eyes and ears, foaming at the mouth, convulsing. Korovina ran to him. She ordered the others to stay back, and then within moments, she began showing the same symptoms. She collapsed on top of him. What followed, according to Valentina Unchenko, who was the only one who would survive to describe it, was something close to chaos. Tatiana Filipenko began clawing at her own throat. She started slamming her head against a rock. Others ran into the tree line, convulsing. Some bit each other. The group, which had been a functioning, experienced team under a capable leader, came apart in a matter of minutes. Valentina was 17 years old. She was the only one not showing symptoms, and she was surrounded by 6 people she cared about who were dying in front of her in the most violent and inexplicable way. She ran. She found the tree line. She spent 4 days alone on that mountain before she was found by a group of Ukrainian kayakers on the river below. She was alive. The search party found the bodies on August 24th, 3 weeks later. 5 of the younger hikers had died of what the official autopsy listed as hypothermia. Korovina's death was attributed to a heart attack, and that was the official conclusion. Hypothermia. Here's the problem. Hypothermia doesn't look like that. It doesn't produce instant convulsions and bleeding from the eyes and ears. It doesn't cause people to bash their own heads against rocks. It doesn't kill a group of experienced, clothed hikers within minutes of each other on a summer morning in early August. The autopsies also noted pulmonary edema, which means fluid in the lungs, and bruising of the lung tissue. That is not what hypothermia does to a body. And then there's Valentina. In her original 1993 account, she described blood everywhere. When she gave another interview in 2018, 25 years later, she said there had been no blood. She said that she may have misremembered. And look, trauma does strange things to memory. That is absolutely real. But the discrepancy has never been fully explained. And Valentina spent most of those 25 years not talking about it at all. The case is sometimes called the other Dyatlov Pass, after the 1959 incident in the Ural Mountains, where 9 experienced hikers died under similar inexplicable circumstances. The comparison isn't perfect, but I understand why people reach for it. Both cases involved experienced people in the Russian wilderness, dying in ways the official record cannot adequately explain. Both cases leave the question of what actually happened, sitting completely open. So here is where it gets genuinely complicated, because the symptoms, the location, the timing, and the survivor's fragmented account point in several different directions at once, and none of them lead to a clean answer. The first theory is the official one, and the one I find hardest to accept, that the group died of hypothermia, with Korovina additionally succumbing to cardiac arrest. The argument in its favor is that the conditions were generally terrible. Wet, cold, high altitude, exhausted bodies, days of accumulated stress. Hypothermia can make people behave irrationally. It can cause confusion and panic. There's a documented phenomenon called paradoxal undressing, where people in the late stages of hypothermia remove their clothing because they suddenly feel intensely hot. Some of the bodies were found without full clothing. The official explanation doesn't claim hypothermia as comfortable or peaceful. It just claims it's what happened. But it can't account for the speed. Experienced hikers don't go from functional to dead in minutes from hypothermia. It also can't account for the pulmonary bruising, the bleeding from the face, the convulsions, or the fact that a 17-year-old standing among them showed no symptoms whatsoever. The official record in this case feels like a determination made by people who needed a determination, not by people who had actually figured out what happened. The theory that keeps coming back, the one researchers return to more than any other, involves chemical exposure, specifically a toxic gas or an agent, either military in origin or geological, that the group encountered in a concentrated form on that slope. Two substances come up most often. One is cyanogen chloride, sometimes called CK, which is a blood agent developed for the use as a chemical weapon. It can exist in liquid form in cold, wet soil. The theory is that it lay dormant in the ground, possibly from the Soviet-era military testing in the region, and was reactivated, possibly by the heat of a campfire the previous night, possibly by some interaction with the wet snow as it warmed. Once it converts to a gaseous state, it's extraordinarily fast-acting. Exposure causes convulsions, hemorrhaging from the face, and pulmonary damage. The speed of death is consistent with what Valentina described, and the reason she survived, according to this version, is that she was positioned differently, or she didn't drink from the shared container that morning, or she was downwind of the others when the concentration was highest. The other substance that gets proposed is hydrogen sulfide, a geological gas that can seep from the ground in volcanic or seismically active regions. The Baikal Rift Zone is one of the most geologically active areas in Asia. H2S at sufficient concentrations causes rapid unconsciousness and death. It smells like rotten eggs at low concentrations, but at high concentrations actually deadens your ability to smell it, so you wouldn't know it was there. That part is genuinely terrifying to think about. What makes the chemical theory compelling, beyond the symptom match, is the geography. The Khamar Daban range was not far from Soviet military installations. The 1990s were a period when a lot of information about what had been happening in remote Siberia under Soviet government was just starting to surface, and a lot of it was disturbing. The idea that a hiking trail ran through a contamination zone that had never been disclosed is not far-fetched, given what we now know about the Soviet military and the way it treated its own people and its own land. Now, if you need something that fits inside the known natural world without involving military secrets or geological vents, there's a botanical explanation that deserves a serious look. The Khamar Daban range is home to a plant called aconite, specifically a species called Aconinium sokachivi. Aconite is one of the most poisonous plants in the world. It causes cardiac arrhythmia and convulsions. Ingesting it produces symptoms that look a great deal like what Valentina described. If the group made tea or cooked something that incorporated aconite, either by accident or because someone mistook it for an edible plant, the effects would be fast and catastrophic. And again, if Valentina didn't drink from the shared pot that morning, she would have been fine. But the problem with the botanical theory is dosage and distribution. Getting enough aconite into enough people fast enough to produce simultaneous collapse across a group is a harder thing to achieve than it might seem, particularly by accident. I mean, it's possible, but the all-at-once nature of what Valentina describes is harder to explain with a plant than with an airborne agent. Then there's infrasound, which I include here because it appears in serious discussions of this case, not as a fringe idea. Infrasound is low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing. Certain wind patterns and mountain terrain can generate infrasound at frequencies that cause psychological distress, including panic, disorientation, and a feeling of profound dread. Some research suggests it can even affect vision. There are researchers who think infrasound may have played a role in the Dyatlov Pass case, and the Khamar Daban mountains are the kind of geography where infrasound-generating wind patterns are possible. The theory doesn't explain the bleeding and the convulsions on its own, but it might explain why the group responded to whatever was happening with such complete psychological disintegration, why Tatiana was hitting her own head against a rock. Panic amplified to the point of self-destruction. And then there's the version of this story that most researchers don't write down in the same sentence as the others, but that I think deserves to be said out loud. There is something about this case, specifically the speed of it, the completeness of the collapse, the total disappearance of rational behavior in experienced and capable people, that sits at the edge of what any of the natural explanations can fully account for. Korovina had survived conditions that would have ended most people. Sasha was her best student. These were not people who panicked easily, who made bad decisions, who frightened fast. Something met them on that slope that was simply beyond the category of anything they had been prepared for. Some people who study this case, not all of them fringe thinkers, find themselves at a loss to explain it within a purely physical framework. I'm not telling you what I think happened. I'm telling you that I understand why the question stays open. Where I keep landing is with the chemical exposure theory, specifically the military or industrial contamination angle, because it fits the symptoms, it fits the geography, it fits the history of how the Soviet government treated remote wilderness, and it fits the one detail that matters more than almost any other. Valentina survived. Not because she was stronger or faster or better trained, but because she may not have been exposed. A 17-year-old alive because of chance, 6 people gone in minutes, and the official explanation that has never quite covered the distance between what it says and what actually happened on that slope. I think about Valentina sometimes, 17 years old, alone on a mountain in Siberia, walking a power line towards something she hoped was civilization. 4 days by herself before anyone found her. And then she went quiet for 25 years. When she finally did speak in 2018, parts of her story had changed. The blood she described in her original 1993 account, the blood that was everywhere, was gone. She said that she may have misremembered, and maybe she did. I don't say any of this to be hard on her. But it's worth asking what Russia looked like in 1993. The Soviet Union had just collapsed. The military was in chaos. Secrets that had been buried for decades were starting to surface, and a lot of people in positions of power had very strong reasons to keep certain things buried a little longer. A teenage girl who had just watched 6 people die in ways that pointed toward military contamination on a classified testing ground would have been an inconvenient witness. The pressure to say less, to remember differently, to simply not talk about it, that pressure would not have needed to be dramatic to be effective. It may not have even needed to be explicit. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm just saying the silence fits. The Khamar Daban range is still there. People still hike it. Whatever met that group on August 5th, 1993 has not announced itself again. And the one person who saw it has said just enough to remind us that we still don't know what it was. Still Unexplained is created and hosted by me, Mark Evanoff. You can find the show and episode previews at www.stillunexplained.com. Please follow wherever you listen, leave a rating or review, and share it with someone who'd appreciate it. I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.